Lamuara, a haunting adventure into the world of lost spirits. Today's story takes us to an eerie, abandoned town nestled in the mountains of Spain, where a group of friends decided to see if the tales of hauntings were true. Spoiler alert, they were not disappointed. But before we dive into all the mysterious details, welcome to the channel. If you're into strange, dark, and mysterious stories, you're definitely in the right place. We upload new stories like this every week, so if that sounds like your thing, maybe consider hitting that like button. Think of it like making a grilled cheese on the highest heat possible, where you burn the breads outside but leave the cheese completely unmelted inside. And hey, don't forget to subscribe and turn on all notifications so you're the first to catch our weekly uploads. Alright, let's get into it. On the afternoon of October 16, 1991, a 36-year-old man named Enrique Martinez knelt down, pulled out his pocket knife, and carefully sliced through the stem of a mushroom growing by a mossy log. He added it to his wicker basket, already filled with mushrooms he'd been gathering in the area. Standing up, he paused to soak in the breathtaking view of the lush green valley below him. Enrique was out hunting for mushrooms with his wife, Anna, and their friends, Jorge and Sofia, a couple who joined them on this little adventure. They'd come to this spot near an old, abandoned town called Lamuara, nestled up in the mountains of northeastern Spain. It was actually Jorge's idea to explore here. He'd heard all sorts of creepy folklore about Lamuara, stories of hauntings and strange happenings. But Enrique, he didn't care much for ghost stories. The town itself wasn't the draw for him. It was all about finding mushrooms, something he loved doing. So, while the group searched for mushrooms, it was clear this trip had a few different motivations. But none of them quite knew how eerie this adventure would become. Enrique and his wife Anna lived in the bustling port city of Tarragona, Spain. Their daily lives were hectic, to say the least. Enrique worked as a bartender, spending every night surrounded by crowds of people coming and going. So, when the opportunity came to get away from it all and just enjoy some peace and quiet in nature, it was an absolute yes. Especially since he'd get to go mushroom hunting, something he loved. After taking in the stunning view of the valley, Enrique turned back to scan the mountainside, looking for a particular type of mushroom that grew in the area. This mushroom, called the bloody milk cap, is known for being perfect for grilling and pairs beautifully with meat. Enrique's plan was to gather as many of these as he could, so when they returned, he could cook a delicious feast for Anna and their friends. Slowly, the group continued their way uphill, making their way toward the outskirts of the abandoned town of Lamuara. Little did they know, this trip was going to be far more memorable than they expected. Lamuara was over 900 years old, now reduced to a scattering of crumbling ruins, with some parts dating back to prehistoric times. This town was never large. At its peak, only around 300 people lived here. But the last of them had left about 40 years ago, turning Lamuara into a true ghost town. As the group arrived, they moved toward a building on the outskirts, a structure that was mostly just a foundation with 3 walls still standing. There was no roof left, but from beside it, they could look straight down what was once the main drag of Lamuara. It was a dirt road lined with ruins, the remnants of buildings long abandoned. About 200 feet down, they could see the town center marked by a large church with an imposing steeple. Surprisingly, the church hadn't completely fallen apart and was still mostly intact, unlike the other structures around it. And behind the church, partially visible, was an overgrown cemetery that added a somber touch to this abandoned landscape. Off to the side of the church was an overgrown pond filled with croaking frogs, adding yet another eerie element to the scene. Enrique and his friends stood by the crumbling building, taking in Lamuara in silence. They had expected it to feel creepy. After all, this place was supposedly haunted, which was the main reason Jorge wanted to come. But now, seeing it in person, the creepiness was way beyond anything they'd imagined. It looked and felt truly unsettling. And then, as if to amplify the spookiness, a mist began rolling in, slowly wrapping itself around the town. Jorge had mentioned to his friends that the mist was a signature feature of Lamuara. At night, it would completely shroud the town in a thick white fog. But here they were, in the middle of the day, and the mist was already starting to creep in. Finally, Jorge broke the silence and said, "Hey, I want to show you guys something." Jorge grabbed his girlfriend Sofia's hand and began jogging down the main road toward the church. Enrique and Ana followed a few steps behind, but after only 10 or 20 feet, Enrique turned around to look back at where they'd been standing by the dilapidated building. To his surprise, he couldn't see it anymore. The mist had thickened and completely covered it. A chill ran through him. He remembered Jorge saying the mist was supposed to come at night, but here they were, surrounded by fog in broad daylight. Trying to shake off the uneasy feeling, Enrique turned back around and hurried to catch up with the others. When they reached Jorge and Sofia a little farther down the road, the two were standing by an odd, rectangular rock about 2 feet tall, jutting up from the ground. Jorge placed his hand on top of it, a satisfied look on his face, and said, "This is the Sistone, and they say it holds dark powers." The Sistone was one of the oldest relics in all of Lamuara. Long ago, Muslim armies used to march through this town, which is actually how Lamuara got its name. It means the place to march. And whenever these armies passed through Lamuara on their way to the valley below, they would stop at the Sistone, believing it held magical powers that could help them defeat their enemies in battle. Though the armies were long gone, the Sistone remained. To this day, people still say it holds dark, mysterious powers. Some even believe that touching it is risky, claiming that it's a portal to a parallel world filled with demonic entities. Jorge shared all of this with the group, warning them about the dangers of touching it. But here's the thing. The whole time he's telling this story, he's got his hands firmly planted on the Sistone. When he finished, he looked at the others with a smirk and said, "Come on, someone else touch it." Sofia immediately shook her head, saying, "Absolutely not. I'm not tempting any evil spirits today." But Enrique's wife, Ana, stepped forward and said, "You know what? I'll touch it." Jorge grinned, pulling his hand off the Sistone, and Ana took a deep breath before placing her hand on the rock. The group held their breath, half expecting something supernatural to happen, like Ana getting pulled into the stone. But nothing happened. After a few moments, Ana lifted her hand, and they all burst into laughter. But then, just seconds later, Enrique noticed something strange. The frogs in the pond down by the church suddenly sounded much louder, as if someone had cranked up their volume. Curiosity took over, and Enrique turned, staring down the misty road towards the pond, trying to make out what might be causing the frogs to go crazy. Through the thick fog, he could barely see it, and just beyond the pond, looming faintly in the mist, was the church. The fog around the church was thick, but just for a second, it parted. And in that brief moment, Enrique got a clear view of one of the church windows. Standing in the window was a dark figure, just staring back at him and his friends. Enrique's heart skipped a beat, but before he could react, the figure disappeared, and the fog rolled back in, covering the window entirely. He was left standing there, stunned, wondering if he'd actually seen something or if his mind was playing tricks on him. But before he could even begin to process it, he heard someone calling his name. Snapping out of his daze, Enrique turned to find Ana grinning at him, jokingly saying, "Come on, Enrique, you should touch the stone too." He quickly scanned the faces of Ana, Sofia, and Jorge, all laughing, clearly unaware of what he'd just seen. Enrique glanced back toward the church and the window, now hidden in the fog, and told himself, "There's no way I actually saw a dark figure moving around in that abandoned church, right?" Enrique shook his head, trying to convince himself that it must have been his imagination. "I'm totally fine," he said. But when he turned back to his friends, he could see they weren't going to let this go until he touched the stone. With a sigh, he finally relented. "Fine," he said, walking up to the Sistone and placing his hand on it. The moment his hand made contact, everything shifted. The air around him grew noticeably cooler, while the stone itself began to warm under his touch. As he stood there, Enrique thought to himself, "Wow, I could do this for hours. I could just leave my hand on this stone. It feels amazing." But then, buried deep in the back of his mind, a voice began to emerge, urging him, "Get away from this stone. Take your hand away. Get away right now." Finally, Enrique yanked his hand back. As soon as he did, all those strange feelings vanished. The air returned to normal, and the urge to touch the stone faded. Confused, he stood there, wondering what had just happened. Anna and Jorge were both grinning at him, eager to hear about his experience with the stone. But behind them, Sofia, Jorge's girlfriend, looked unhappy. She had been the only one who hadn't touched the stone, and finally spoke up, saying, "Guys, let's get away from the stone. I don't want to keep tempting evil spirits. Okay? Let's just go," Sofia insisted. Jorge, ever the jokester, threw his arm around her shoulders and said, "Come on, lighten up. Let's do some more exploring." He took Sofia's hand and started walking down the main road toward the church. Anna, Enrique's wife, quickly followed, practically running to keep up, like a child thrilled by an adventure. But Enrique lingered for a moment longer. Despite telling himself that what he saw in the window was just his imagination, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed when he touched the stone. There was definitely something off about the stone, and now the entire village was completely enveloped in fog. By this point, Enrique really wanted to leave Lamuara. The place was starting to creep him out, but he didn't want to be the party pooper. So he took a deep breath and finally turned to follow his friends and wife. As he walked a little ways, the fog parted just enough for him to see the pond, still filled with loud, croaking frogs, as well as the church and that window where he thought he had seen the dark figure. But now the window was empty. Enrique felt a wave of relief wash over him when he saw that his friends hadn't stopped at the church. They had instead moved behind it, wandering into the cemetery. He had no intention of stepping inside the church. Even though he'd convinced himself that the figure in the window wasn't real, a part of him wanted to keep his distance from the building. As he walked past the pond and skirted around the church toward the cemetery, something compelled him to stop and face the window, the very same spot where he had seen the dark figure. Once again, the window was empty, but even so, it felt like something was tugging at him, urging him to approach it. Without saying a word to his friends, who were too busy exploring the cemetery to notice him, Enrique stepped closer to the window. He found himself right in front of it, peering inside. The interior of the church was a complete ruin, but he could still make out where the pews had once been and the pulpit where the priest used to deliver mass. As Enrique stood there, he felt an irresistible urge to lean closer and closer into the church. The desire to pull away was there, but it was like an unseen force kept drawing him in, deeper into that dark opening. Just then, the croaking of the frogs intensified, growing louder and louder until it felt as if the sounds were wrapping around him, consuming him entirely. Meanwhile, just around the corner of the church and back in the cemetery, Anna, Jorge, and Sofia were laughing and strolling among the headstones, reading the inscriptions. At one point, Anna glanced around and noticed that Enrique was missing. Concerned, she walked over to the cemetery gate and looked up the side of the church. There she found Enrique, leaning intently into the window, peering inside. "Enrique!" she called out a couple of times, but he didn't seem to hear her. He remained transfixed, his gaze locked on the church interior. Growing more concerned, Anna approached him, shaking his shoulder gently. When she did, Enrique finally snapped out of his daze, turning to look at her with a completely bewildered expression. "Come on, let's go into the cemetery," Anna urged, trying to coax him back to their friends. "That's where everyone is." With that, she turned and skipped back toward the cemetery. Once there, she resumed her exploration, walking among the various headstones, her laughter echoing in the stillness. At one point, while inspecting a particularly interesting gravestone, she took a step back to get a better look, only to accidentally bump into another headstone, a large cross with a line etched across it. To her horror, it toppled over and shattered on the ground. Jorge and Sofia heard the sharp crack of the stone breaking and quickly turned to see Anna's frantic movements. They exchanged glances and quickly pieced together what had happened. Jorge burst into laughter, teasing, "Oh boy, now you've really upset the evil spirits in this town. You better put that back together." Anna tried to brush it off, laughing along, but inside she was in full panic mode. The last thing she wanted was to have desecrated a grave in a potentially haunted town. She knelt down, frantically trying to piece the headstone back together, but it was clear. This stone was shattered beyond repair. As Anna struggled with the broken headstone, Jorge's laughter continued to echo around her, making light of her mistake. But right next to him, Sofia began to feel uneasy. "Hey, Jorge," she asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and concern. "Is it really true that this place is haunted? Like, is this actually a haunted town? What's the story?" Jorge paused his teasing, turning to Sofia with a more serious expression. "Yeah, I think this place really is haunted," he said, and then he launched into the story of how Lamuara earned its eerie reputation, weaving together the tales of its ghostly inhabitants and the folklore that surrounded this forgotten town. Back in October of 1873, a civil war was raging in this part of Spain. One of the rival armies had turned the caves in the mountains near Lamuara into makeshift field hospitals for their wounded soldiers. One fateful night, a renowned general named Cercos was wounded in battle and brought to one of these caves, where he ultimately succumbed to his injuries. General Cercos was a beloved leader, and the men with him were determined to give him a proper burial. However, they knew they had to keep his death a secret. If the rest of the troops learned that their leader had fallen, it would be utterly demoralizing and would grant their enemies a significant advantage. In the dead of night, 6 of Cercos's loyal men fashioned a coffin and placed his body inside. As dawn approached, they stealthily carried the coffin up to Lamuara and buried him in the cemetery behind the church, ensuring that no one would know of his passing. Weeks later, however, 5 armed soldiers from the opposing side climbed the mountain into Lamuara. Unbeknownst to them, General Cercos had died in battle. They believed he was hiding somewhere in Lamuara, completely unaware of the tragedy that had befallen their enemy. The soldiers began barging into the homes of civilians in Lamuara, tearing them apart in their frantic search for General Cercos. They dragged the townspeople out into the streets, threatening them with death unless they revealed the general's whereabouts. After an hour of this intimidation, an elderly man, worn down by the chaos, stepped forward and declared to the soldiers that General Cercos was dead and buried in the cemetery behind the church. Skeptical, the soldiers demanded proof. The old man replied, "I can't tell you exactly where he's buried. I only heard that's where he was laid to rest." Unconvinced, the soldiers ordered, "Gather everyone and take us to the cemetery now." Reluctantly, the townspeople made their way to the cemetery, with the soldiers following closely behind. Once they arrived, the soldiers commanded the villagers to start digging up the graves, determined to uncover Cercos's body. As the townspeople began to dig, the croaking of the frogs from the nearby pond intensified, growing louder and louder. The cacophony reached a peak, prompting the leader of the rival soldiers to step away from the chaos in the cemetery. Frustrated, he walked over to the pond and fired his gun into the water, trying to silence the relentless frogs. Yet, instead of quieting, the frogs only grew louder. Defeated, the leader turned back to the cemetery, only to find that the townspeople had stopped digging. They had excavated nearly every grave, yet General Cercos was nowhere to be found. They stood in tense silence, unsure of what to do next. As he surveyed the graveyard, the leader's gaze landed on one grave that had been left untouched amidst the chaos. Everything around it had been disturbed, but this grave stood defiantly pristine. He pointed and commanded, "Dig that one up." The townspeople recoiled, visibly shaken, refusing to approach it. Finally, one brave villager stepped forward and explained, "That grave belongs to an old woman who died recently. Everyone believes she was a witch. Digging her up could be dangerous." But the rival soldiers showed no concern for such superstitions. The soldiers raised their guns, demanding the townspeople to unearth the grave immediately. Reluctantly, the townspeople complied, carefully digging up the coffin. When the soldiers finally pried open the lid, an eerie silence fell over the gathering. The woman, who had died weeks earlier, lay inside, seemingly perfectly preserved. Her skin was pale, untouched by decay, with a faint pinkish hue still lingering on her cheeks. Her lips were parted, as if she had been buried mid-sentence. But what truly froze everyone in place were her wide-open eyes, staring directly at them. After a moment of stunned silence, the townspeople erupted into cries and screams, stumbling backward from the coffin in sheer terror. Even the soldiers, taken aback by the sight, felt a flicker of fear, but their anger quickly overshadowed it. Finding the woman instead of the general only fueled their frustration. In a fit of rage, the soldiers dragged the witch's lifeless body from her grave and strung her up to a nearby tree. There, they unleashed a hail of bullets upon her, their fury manifesting as they mercilessly shot at her until her body was reduced to a grotesque mess, obliterated by the gunfire. When the soldiers finally ceased their relentless gunfire, a heavy silence enveloped the scene. Just moments before, the chaotic symphony of frogs croaking in the pond had been deafening, but now it had all vanished, leaving an unsettling stillness in its wake. This eerie quiet unnerved the soldiers so deeply that they turned on their heels and fled, not uttering a single word to the townspeople. Once the soldiers were gone, the townspeople sprang into action, working to reinter their dead. Amidst the somber task, one townsman jumped into the grave where the witch had been laid to rest. As he landed at the bottom, he felt his foot sink an extra foot into the earth. Startled, he realized he had struck something hollow. Curious, he began to dig, uncovering another coffin hidden beneath the witch's. It was General Serkos's coffin, concealed from the soldiers' search. When those 6 men had secretly buried General Serkos, they had placed his coffin at the bottom of an open grave, intending it to be filled with another's. They covered it just enough with dirt to hide it from view, and the following day, the townspeople unknowingly lowered the witch into the grave, completely unaware of the general resting beneath her. They filled in the grave and placed a headstone over her final resting place. However, since they believed her to be a witch, they chose not to inscribe her name on the stone. Instead, they etched a simple horizontal line across its surface. After the tragic desecration of this woman's grave and her body by the rival soldiers, Lamuara transformed irreparably. The townspeople began to die one after another. Their soil grew barren, and crops failed to thrive. Insects invaded, and plagues of illness swept through the town. Before long, Lamuara had acquired a reputation for being cursed. By the 1950s, this alleged curse had driven the last remaining residents away, officially marking it as a ghost town. As Jorge concluded the story, Anna stood horrified, staring down at the ground. It dawned on her that the gravestone she had accidentally knocked over and shattered bore a horizontal line across its middle. It was the witch's headstone that she had desecrated. A wave of dread washed over her, and just as she was about to call out to Jorge and Sofia to leave, her gaze fell upon the base of one of the cemetery walls. There, amidst the unsettling atmosphere, she spotted the perfect bloody milk cap mushroom, the exact type she knew her husband had been searching for. Anna hurried over to the mushroom, picked it up, and turned to show it to Enrique, only to find that he was no longer in the cemetery. Confusion washed over her. Wait, did my husband even follow me back into the cemetery after I saw him by the church? She couldn't quite remember. In her heart, she thought he had, but doubt crept in. "Enrique!" she shouted, her voice echoing in the stillness, but there was no response. Panic began to rise within her as she turned to Sofia and Jorge, who were just silhouettes through the thick fog. "Hey, have you seen my husband? Is he in here? Do you know where he went?" Both of them shook their heads, their expressions a mix of concern and confusion. "No, we have no idea," they replied. At this point, the eerie atmosphere of Lamuara was becoming overwhelming for Anna. She dropped the mushroom and bolted out of the cemetery, her heart racing. Sofia and Jorge, still unaware of the urgency that consumed Anna, exchanged puzzled glances as they watched her dash away. They casually strolled after her, turning the corner to exit the cemetery and walking alongside the church. The visibility was horrendous, the fog thickening around them. They couldn't see Anna or Enrique, but they could hear her voice, calling out for him repeatedly. As they moved through the gloom, Shadows flickered in the mist, tricking them into thinking they were glimpsing either Anna or Enrique. But each time they reached the spots where the shadows danced, they found only emptiness. Sofia gripped Jorge's arm tighter and tighter, a growing unease creeping over them both. Jorge, who had initially joked about the evil of the place, now felt a chill running down his spine. They quickened their pace, moving toward the sound of Anna's voice. As they drew closer, the chorus of frogs from the nearby pond swelled, drowning out Anna's calls until they could barely hear her at all. Suddenly, as if someone had flipped a switch, the frogs fell silent. All that remained was the heart-wrenching sound of Anna crying. Though the fog obscured their view, Jorge and Sofia pressed on, guided by the sorrow in her voice. Finally, they spotted Anna crouched down, her back to them, right where Enrique had been standing moments earlier, peering into the church window. Sofia and Jorge approached cautiously, reaching down to rest their hands on her shoulders. When Anna turned to face them, she clutched Enrique's wicker basket filled with mushrooms. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she whispered to her friends, "He's gone." For the next hour, Anna, Jorge, and Sofia searched desperately for Enrique throughout Lamuara, their hopes fading with each empty moment. As the fog thickened and darkness enveloped Lamuara, visibility dwindled, making it nearly impossible to search for someone. After an hour of fruitless calling for Enrique, Anna, Jorge, and Sofia exchanged anxious glances, their hope fading. They realized their best option was to leave and alert the authorities. When they did, a massive search was initiated, sweeping across the desolate landscape for the next week. Yet, despite their efforts, no trace of Enrique was found. He had vanished, leaving only the wicker basket Anna had discovered. Finally, after a week of relentless searching, the authorities called off the effort, suggesting that Enrique likely wandered off and succumbed to the wild terrain, his body destined to be discovered by hikers at some later date. But Anna couldn't accept such a bleak conclusion. Determined, she continued to return to Lamuara, each visit fueled by an unwavering hope that she would find her husband. In January of 1992, 3 months after Enrique's disappearance, Anna, Sofia, and Jorge returned once more to search the forsaken village. As they passed the church, they approached the very window where Enrique had stood, peering inside just days before. To their shock, they saw 6 dark figures draped in robes, standing in a circle on the main floor, where the pews once thrived. They appeared eerily still, their presence thickening the air around them. Annoyed, Anna's first thought was that they were ghost hunters, lured by the mystery surrounding her husband's disappearance. After all, the story had captured headlines, transforming Lamuara into a paranormal hotspot. But for Anna, this was no game. Her husband was missing, and these figures felt like an insult to her pain. Determined to confront the intruders, Anna marched up to the window, ready to scold the robed figures for their disrespect. But just as she opened her mouth, one of them turned and met her gaze. Anna staggered back in horror. The figure had no face, only a dark void that seemed to swallow the light around it. Despite the absence of eyes, she felt a chilling awareness, as if the entity were locking onto her very soul. Before she could process this, a thunderous galloping erupted from behind them, the sound of hooves pounding against the earth like a stampede of wild horses. At the same time, the cacophony of frogs from the nearby pond crescendoed, a deafening chorus that filled the air. Startled, the trio spun around, expecting to see a cavalry charging through the fog. But there was nothing, just the oppressive mist swirling on the empty road. Heart racing, they turned back to the church, but the 6 hooded figures had vanished without a trace. Panic surged through them. They exchanged frantic glances, the realization hitting them like a punch. They had to leave. Without a moment's hesitation, they sprinted away from Lamuara, the weight of dread pushing them forward. Enrique was never found. His absence lingered like a shadow over Anna and her friends, a haunting reminder of the unsolved mystery that shrouded Lamuara. The town remained steeped in sorrow, for many others had vanished there too, their fates lost to the whispering fog. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the unknown. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new tale. Your support means the world to me. Until next time, keep seeking out the strange and mysterious. I'll see you in the next video.